Hello, everybody, and welcome to this latest round of Napa Valley sessions in support of the Premier Napa Valley auction. I'm Andy Erickson. I am a vintner in Napa Valley and also a member of the board of directors of the Napa Valley Vintners Association. And it is my pleasure to welcome Antonio Galloni to the session, who will be hosting. I think probably close to 100% of everyone on here knows Antonio and Vinous, and hopefully, like me, you've recognized that Antonio has raised the bar in terms of content and everything to do with wine. I mean, I love the website, I love the multimedia, it's just incredible, the maps. And I was thinking about this introduction, and I have to say, for me, I wanted to take it back to, and Antonio, you could correct me, but 2008, 2009, somewhere around there, when this new guy was coming to the Valley. And, for weeks preceding that, vintners, winemakers, we were all calling each other and wondering, like, what's happening? The torch is being passed. Who is this guy? What's going to happen? He loves Barolo, and who doesn't love Barolo, but does he even know our wines? And I have to say now, fast forwarding to 2021, I'm just so thankful, Antonio, how supportive you are of the Valley. And I'm not even talking about reviews. I mean, everybody loves a good review, but just how you've really embraced Napa Valley and supported us. I mean, I think of Inspire Napa Valley and some of the other things you've done. And today is no exception. So thank you so much for being a part of what we do and for being our cheerleader. And Antonio, take it away.
So Andy, I'm going to do my best to live up to that incredible introduction. And for the benefit of folks watching, well, first of all, welcome. This is going to be an amazing session. I got to say that right away. Rutherford, we're in the heart of Napa Valley. We've got three fantastic vintners to bring into the conversation in a minute and to focus on, and some wonderful wines and a lot of history to talk about. But it wasn't accidental, the whole Napa Valley thing for me, Andy. Maybe a lot of people don't know, but I had the fortune of growing up in a family with parents who sold wine. It was mostly Italian and French wine, but I got interested in wine at an early age. And as an out-of-work musician in the early 90s, working in some pretty great Boston and Cambridge restaurants, I sold the first vintages of things like Peter Michael and Harlan Estate. We had Corison on the list, and Frog's Leap, Schaefer. So my introduction to these wines was unfortunately, I guess, some while ago. And then of course from there it just sort of escalated as it sort of became, as writing about wine became a profession. But it wasn't something sort of accidental that just sort of happened. And we're going to talk about one of the wines that was a seminal wine for me when we get to BV, but in the early 2000s was when which is unfortunately now 20 years ago, so I'm dating myself, but I had the first chance to taste older Napa Valley wines and to taste wines with age. And that was a real seminal moment on my own. I'd like to just ask our panelists to join. Everybody's been very diligent about keeping their audio and video muted, but now is the time to, we're going to talk about Rutherford. So it's the southern part of Napa Valley. So Andy, you know quite well, Coonsville, and we're going to talk about Stag's Leap. And then we're going to wrap up on Thursday with a look at varieties outside of Cabernet Sauvignon, because as those of us who love history know that the history of Napa Valley is much richer than Cabernet. We love Cabernet, but there's Petit Syrah and Zinfandel and Sauvignon Blanc, et cetera, et cetera. And all of these things have their role as well. Some of them very historic roles. We're going to talk about that on Thursday. So that's kind of the program. And I'm seeing some questions and some chats coming through. So yeah, the goal is to keep this interactive. We'd love to answer your questions. It's really a treat to be able to spend time with winemakers of this pedigree and this much experience. And so I'd urge you to just take advantage of it, because it doesn't happen every day. So I want to welcome our three panelists. Again, the topic is going to be Rutherford. So I'm going to introduce each panelist. The format is we're going to introduce each panelist. We're going to get into talking about wine and vineyards and whatever you want. And then we'll take some questions, as they come up, if they're relevant or to the specific topics we're talking about, or wrap them into the end. We'll close with an overview of the auction lots that each.
Okay, let's go.
Oops. that each winery has put together. So we're going to start off with Trevor Durling at Beaulieu Vineyard. You have an unbelievable background, UC Davis, degree in viticulture and enology. You worked at Sonoma-Cutrer, Gloria Ferrer, joined BV as just the 5th chief winemaker. I mean, that is just unbelievable to think about what that means to be like the 5th person in the job. I mean, who can say that? I mean, that's just really quite amazing. And so, and then and I would like to also introduce Chris Phelps at Inglenook. You have an incredible background too, Chris. I mean, every time I talk to you, I feel like I've just gone to school. You studied both at UC Davis and Bordeaux. You worked at a small chateau called Petrus on the right bank of Bordeaux. What an experience. You were involved in early days of Dominus in Napa Valley. You worked at Camus at Swanson. You're making these wines at Inglenook, but you also make beautiful wines under your own label at Vivum. So there's just a wealth of experience here as well. And our third panelist is Christy Melton, who I met many years ago, also studied at UC Davis. You've worked at Saintsbury, Clos Duval, where you were instrumental in turning around those wines. And now you're in Napa Valley. In fact, that's true of all 3 of these properties. So I think we should just jump right in and make the most of our time. Trevor, I want to start with you because around 2000 or 2001, I had this friend who had an incredible wine collection. And every time I would go to his house, he'd give me like wines, like just like give me like the full bottles. Like, here, you got to taste this, you got to taste that. And there would be bottles like Ornellaia and Pichon Lalande and all sorts of like crazy wines. And one of these wines was a BV private, a Georges Latour from the mid-70s. And I tasted this wine and it changed my life. It was the first time I had tasted, I mean, as I said, I had sold these other wines, you know, but they were on release. The Harlans and the Schaefers and the Cathy Corsons, but that mid-70s BV, that was the first time I had tasted like a proper aged Napa Valley wine, 25, 30 years old. And I was just completely blown away. So I want to start with you because BV is such an important wine for me, but also for you, and just, you know, get a sense from you of so what does it mean to be like the 5th person in your job? I mean, I would be terrified. What is, I mean, I don't want to scare you, but I mean, what is that like to take over that mantle like that?
Well, thank you for such an awesome intro, Antonio. And, you know, I have to say it's obviously a huge honor to get to do that. And I certainly have some very big shoes to fill. But like you, I actually had huge honor to do that. And it's relatively similar to like you, I actually had, which was with the 1968 vintage of Georgia Private Reserve. And so this was actually while I was a student at UC Davis, I was invited to a competitive tasting from a family friend of mine who, you know, they get together in a monthly tasting group. They'll pick an appellation, you know, somewhere around the world and a specific vintage, and then everybody will bring a bottle, they'll blind them and have a great time tasting wines and eating food and all that. So I must have done something very good in my previous life to get invited to this at such a young age, but the theme was 1968 Napa Valley. And I got to taste a Heights Martha's Vineyard, you know, some amazing Inglenook wines, by the way, Chris. I think I had a Charbonneau and a Cabernet from that year and just some incredible wines. And there was one that just stood out to me and absolutely blew me away and really became kind of my aha wine as a winemaker. And that was the 1968 Georges de Latour Private Reserve. So, you know, to now have the honor to get to lead that very winery that did that to me all of those years ago is just kind of, you know, indescribable. So yeah, it's amazing, big shoes to fill, and really excited to be able to be the steward of such an important part of American winemaking history and really write that next chapter.
We just, in addition, obviously that's a historic wine for Napa Valley. Not necessarily a single vineyard wine. It's always been a blend of various parcels, but yes. In addition to that wine, you also make some single clone wines, right? Which are newer wines. Tell us about those.
Yeah, sure. So that's actually what we're going to taste through a little bit later. We'll try 2 versions of the 2013 vintage, so the Clone 4 and the Clone 6. This is something that began with a trial, a clonal research trial that Beaulieu did in conjunction with UC Davis, starting in 1981. And really the purpose of this was to look at about 15 different clonal selections of Cabernet, which they planted in one of our vineyards in Oakville, on the western side of Oakville, actually, to really understand the differences between them in terms of yield, you know, berry size, and just overall quality to really help our understanding of what would be best suited to replant our estate vineyards to as various blocks came to that time. And so two of the favorites out of that original trial, and this was done over a decade's time, happened to be Clone 4 and Clone 6. And we'll get into the differences between those two in just a little bit. But today, those are really the building blocks of what Georges de Latour Private Reserve is. And we do bottle a very small amount of each of them on their own so that people can kind of understand the differences. They're actually both from the same vineyard, which is really cool. It's just an interesting thing to offer our visitors. And, it's an amazing conversation whenever people come in and get to taste them.
You mentioned something really important, which is tasting. So I think everybody should pour themselves a glass of wine. And as we get, and we're going to come back to the wines in a second, but there's a link between BV and Freemark Abbey, which we're going to talk about. And I want to bring in Christy Melton to talk about Freemark, because Christy, you're also taking over a historic estate, and I have to say, you guys have both breathed like fresh life into these properties. Not that there was anything wrong with them before, but I think it's really incredibly exciting to see like that marriage of like things that are traditional and classic, and things that are the perspective that a younger person is going to bring, which is just a different energy, different vibe. So Freemark Abbey has two historic vineyards. The Bochet vineyard is maybe a little bit older than Sycamore, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. But Bochet was a vineyard. John Bochet used to sell fruit to Beaulieu Vineyard for the Georges Latour, and then that wine, Freemark Abbey, turned it into a single vineyard wine in 1970, which makes it maybe the second single vineyard wine. I think we were talking about before, but Martha's Heights Martha's probably precedes it by a year or two. But we're talking very early days of single vineyard wine, something that's become very much the vogue today in Napa Valley. But Freemark was very early with that, with the Bochet. And then you have the Sycamore, which we'll talk a little bit about later. That's your second vineyard, not second in stature, but your number 2. But so what's that? Tell us about what you've done at Freemark to sort of usher it into the next era. What are you working on?
Thank you. That's an incredible introduction. And, I'm not the 5th winemaker like Trevor is, but I am the 7th since 1886. So the no pressure there either. And we were founded by a woman, and I'm the first since her. So we really love our 2 single vineyard designate wines, and we really love the Rutherford AVA. When Freemark kind of came back to life again in 1967 with the 7 partners that breathed life back into Freemark, that was a really pivotal time. They were all Rutherford-based kind of people, and so we had the partnership with John Bochet. Thank you, Trevor. That wine used to go to BV, but John Bochet, as an attorney, very small ego, very humble man, really wanted his name on that bottle of wine. So over a handshake deal in 1970, we guaranteed that, and we've been making that wine ever since. But we also have another vineyard, and as a redhead, I can say that this wine is thought of like our little redheaded stepchild. It is equal, if not better than, in a lot of vintages. It's our Sycamore vineyard, and it was planted by one of the partners in 1967 of Freemark Abbey. It was planted in the mid-70s, and we've been making this wine since 1980 was our first vintage that we harvested fruit from it, and then in 84 was our first commercial vintage. So both of these really great sites, they're only 1.2 miles apart, but totally different in terms of soil, in terms of really climate. We think Bochet gets a much more agreeable climate to make soft tannins, really fruit-driven wine, and our Sycamore, being closer to the Mayacamas Mountains, a little warmer, gets much more tannin structure, a lot darker fruit character. So this is the wine, if I had to pick one, I hate picking them like children. This is the wine I pick for aging. Bochet is our younger drinking wine. I love this wine, 10, 15 years old. The Sycamore, if I'm doing something 20, 30 years old, that's the wine I go to. So we're really excited about both of these. And that's why I wanted to show you guys Sycamore, because Bochet, but I want you to know Sycamore too.
But I was so excited about the seminar that I think I skipped over something really important. So I'm going to ask Chris to frame it for us, which is, what makes Rutherford a unique appellation? I mean, I totally glossed over that because I was so excited to get started with like all the nitty gritty, but pull us back a little bit, take us back a step. what is it about the Rutherford AVA that is so special and unique, and that gives birth to so many wines? I mean, in a second, we're going to put up our map, and I'll just briefly give an overview of the appellation, but there's just so many great estates. So why?
As you said, Antonio, it's in the heart of the valley, and I think it's sort of this juxtaposition between different features in the contours of the valley, the hills on either side. It's not the narrowest point, it's not the widest point, but I think it's just a sweet spot. And I think I could speak for Chris, and Trevor, and Antonio had this feeling. But when you walk onto a vineyard like Inglenook, like BV, some of BV's vineyards in Rutherford, you feel something. There's sort of this, I don't know, I have this, do you guys know what I mean? There's like this deep sense of something much way beyond us that's there. And I think, so in Rutherford, we have this amazing historical context, you know, and Gustav Niebaum came in 1879. I mean, I honestly don't know if he could have, in his wildest imagination, imagined that we'd still be making wine, and not just wine, but great wines today. But it's thanks to people like him that it was discovered. And I think, you know, we have to distinguish between the bench land, which runs all the way through Rutherford on the Mayacamas side, and the alluvial soils down below that. So that's a really big distinction. One of the things that sets Inglenook apart in our 1,700, well, over 1,600 acre property is that bench land. And that's the part of the volcanic origin soils that have kind of sloughed off the Mayacamas and created this really unique situation. The soils are much more varied on the alluvial fans that extend down into the valley towards the river. So I think it has a lot to do with soils and microclimate, and I'm just kind of rambling. So does that help address the point?
It does. It's a great description, and we're gonna put up our map in a second and show maybe like these major areas, because that western bench off the Mayacamas is home to a lot of great estates, including yours. But that western strip, you know, which is sort of Mayacamas and the foothills of the Mayacamas, you know, there's just some incredible vineyards here, and we're going to try to blow up this map and show you. But you know, you've got the BV vineyards, you know, so this is sort of looking at the north. But if we start at the north, the very north, there's, you know, Flora Springs, which is now owned by Smith Oak Lafitte, and in Bordeaux. Always a good sign when the Bordelais decides to invest in your region, I think. So this is the eastern side. But if we look at the western side, the other side where we were before, and we work our way down, we can see that there's some wonderful vineyards in this area where we are right here. You know, just a few. You know, for example, at the top of the screen, you can see Hewitt, you can see Boucher, you can see BV #1, Inglenook. Towards the back of the mountains, your neighbor JJ Cohn, which is they asked us to name it JJ Cohn on this map, so nobody knows that that's Scarecrow. But now I'm telling everybody. I'm sure I'm going to get in trouble, but that's Scarecrow. There's more Soli Tietjen right in front of that. More Soli Borges. There's a Joseph Phelps vineyard there. There's Staglin. There's Bella Oaks. There's the Sycamore Vineyard, and then that's right next to BD #2. So I mean, that is just all west of Highway 29 in a single appellation. I mean, it's really quite an amazing strip, right? And then if we go over to the other side, if we go, I mean, there's BV10 in the middle, Star, which is famous, you know, for Rick Foreman's Chardonnay. But there's just an enormous number of vineyards, and you know, we won't be able to go over them all in this seminar. But if we look here now, we're on the eastern side, and so we've just sort of flown over Round Pond and one of the Frogs Leap vineyards. Here, there's Heights Trailside, which is a single vineyard wine. There's Camus, their main vineyard. There's Beckstoffer George III, which was another Beaulieu vineyard years ago. There's McGaw. And then as we cross the Silverado Trail, there's Rich Frank's Winston Hill, which he makes a vineyard designate. There's this area of these blocks called Oscar Papa. That's the Bettinelli development, which they call Upper Range, but you see people like Realm making wines from there. And if we go just a little bit north of that, there is that whole sort of Snowden, Sloan Estate, Hall Sacrochet district. And you'll note there's a question about the AVA line, so I might as well just address it now. Our maps are never meant to be AVA maps per se. They take an area and try to be a logical explanation. And so the AVA map on this map is a red dotted line because it does top off, as William says, at 500 feet. And so you can see right above that, that whole sector of Sloan, Hall, and Snowden, and some of the Snowden vineyards are above the AVA line. And we put them in our Rutherford map because we think that makes sense. But that's just, that's like your 90-second look at Rutherford. And it's just amazing to think that all of those vineyards are in one place. So cool. Should we maybe talk about some wine? Trevor, you picked Clone 4 2013. What is it about? I mean, Clone 4 is a historic, it's one of the, I'm not sure if heritage is the right description, but it's certainly one of the old school California clones. How should we think about that clone versus, say, Clone 6, 337?
Yeah. So again, I mean, this is one of my favorite wines to talk about. And I love, the clone series that we produce because it does show kind of a different take, if you will, on Cabernet Sauvignon as a varietal within a relatively close area. So actually this comes from BV2 at the southern end of Rutherford. And it's actually, again, it stems back from a trial that we started with UC Davis going back to 81. And this particular clone comes from cuttings that were grown in down in the southern hemisphere in Mendoza, Argentina. And then were brought up here as cuttings, replanted, and it's now probably one of the more, you could call it old school, but commonly planted Cabernet clones, certainly in our vineyards on the Western Rutherford bench, and probably, I would guess, throughout the Napa Valley, it's pretty commonly grown. It's a pretty consistent producer, so kind of mid-sized clusters, pretty good skin to juice ratio, mid-sized berries, not too big, not too small. It's consistently high quality. I prefer it grown on the valley floor. I think it has a good amount of that varietal character. So you get a little bit of that dried herb note that you might not get in some other clones, which I think is important for Cabernet Sauvignon. And it blends very, very well, with the other clonal selections that we produce. And so you compare it to something like Clone 6, for example. That's another one that is one of our favorites at Beaulieu. And we've nicknamed that the winemaker's clone because it's a very small producer. So most growers don't like growing Clone 6 probably because it promotes a lot of shatter. So there's loose clusters, much lower yield than a lot of other clonal selections of Cabernet. But because of that, you have higher skin to juice ratio, more power. That's the backbone intensity. It really blends beautifully with something like Clone 4. And so you taste the two of them next to each other, and it's really, really interesting to see kind of those differences. So Clone 4, again, it's one of my favorites. It is certainly a big part of the foundation and the core of Georges de la Tour Private Reserve.
Yeah, and you picked 2013, which was a drought year with very small berries, very concentrated wines. And it was at the beginning of this map project. And I remember spending a lot of time in Napa Valley during that vintage, and especially like the month or so or a few weeks before harvest. And you could really see that, that there was going to be you could get a feeling, it was just tasting grapes. You could really get a feeling it was going to be a really concentrated vintage. And 8 years later, there you are, and you're tasting the wine, and you really taste this weight. There's a question about the history of Rutherford, and I think it would be really interesting to hear from you because so much of it has to do with the post-prohibition history, let's say the more recent history of wines that we can actually taste still. A lot of it has to do with BV. So Georges de la Tour comes to Napa Valley. He sees this beautiful place. He calls it Beaulieu, which means beautiful place in French. Fill in the gaps because you know it better than me.
So we were founded in 1900. So one of the oldest and longest continuously operating wineries in the Napa Valley. And it was founded by Georges de la Tour, who was a Frenchman, who between the years of 1900 and 1903 purchased a 130-acre parcel on the western Rutherford bench that is Beaulieu #1. We still own and farm today. And actually, it was his wife that named the property. When she first set foot at the place and saw it, she said, "Quel Beaulieu, what a beautiful place." And of course, that's what they named the vineyard and the resulting winery. Throughout the early 1900s, Georges de Latour, he did have a viticulture background. He knew his stuff, but he was also really an entrepreneur. And so, he was always drawn and had this affinity towards the Napa Valley and Rutherford in particular for a number of reasons. He felt that it had the terroir, this wonderful sense of place, and also for trading reasons. The fact that it opens up to the south, towards the San Francisco Bay, et cetera, would be advantageous for him. And when he first purchased that property, the first thing he did was plant about 80 acres of Petit Syrah on Beaulieu #1. And so he started making little bits of his own wine, but he was actually selling a lot of the grapes to neighboring wineries, and they were using to produce their own wines. He also started importing vines from France that were grafted on phylloxera-resistant rootstocks. And this was very key because by this point in time, it was well documented that this nasty bug called phylloxera, which could completely decimate vineyards, existed in the Napa Valley and in California. So people were losing vineyards left and right. He was bringing these vines in that were resistant to phylloxera, and he saw a big business opportunity, was selling them, propagating them on the land, and made a pretty good living doing that. And then the third and probably most important, well, certainly most important thing that he started doing during this time was to produce sacramental wine for the Catholic Church. And so you probably know where I'm going to go with this, but fast forward a little bit later to 1920 when Prohibition broke out. So from 1920 to 1933, many of the local wineries in the Napa Valley and in all over California were shuttering because of Prohibition. And Georges de Latour was one of the very few Vintners to not only survive this period, but to truly thrive. So he actually quadrupled the size of Beaulieu Vineyard between the years of 1920 and 1933. And it was through this production of sacramental wine as well as medicinal wine. So believe it or not, doctors would prescribe wine as medicine to, treat any ailment that you had. So he was just a brilliant guy. And then, post-Prohibition, this was a point in time where he had become a little bit older, and he really started to shift his focus more towards the quality of wines coming off of his property and, the true potential that he saw, in the area of Rutherford and the Napa Valley in general. So that's where he traveled back to his native country of France, went to the Pasteur Institute, and became acquainted with a man called André Telechev. And André Telechev, I'm sure a lot of us on this have heard his name before, but he's somebody that we refer to as the maestro or the father of Napa Valley Cabernet. This is somebody that really, early upon his arrival at Beaulieu, elevated and single-handedly kind of revolutionized many of the wines coming out of the region in terms of their quality, right? So he had a very scientific approach to winemaking. Many things that we take for granted today, such as strong, sanitation of winemaking equipment, inoculating, fermentation tanks with known strains of yeast and bacteria to finish, primary fermentation, malolactic fermentation, all of that, really were emphasized and strongly pushed by Andre. And I think, the way that he looked at it was really, he wanted to elevate the quality of wines coming out of Beaulieu, but he saw so much potential from the region in general that he very much, was a mentor and tutor to many and shared his knowledge and spread it throughout the area. So we as an industry owe a heck of a lot to this man. We were very fortunate to have him as our winemaker from 1938 until he retired in 1973. And, along the way, he tutored and mentored many of the greats that came after him, such as Mondavi and, Mike Gergich and Joe Heitz, and all these guys went through the school of Telechev. A pretty small man in stature, but a huge, lovely personality, and just did so much for the industry. Then he actually came back to us at Beaulieu in 1991 to consult at the age of 90 years old, where he remained until he passed away in 1994. So truly amazing man. I think his winemaking style was very much terroir driven. He wanted to make clean, pure wines that really expressed the beautiful terroir that we're so fortunate to have in Rutherford. And that's something that, is one of my primary focal points today, is how do I best express this amazing land that we're so fortunate to have. And again, you know, I mean, back to what we were talking about earlier, there's some very, very big shoes to fill. And I can just feel his energy. I mean, I pinch myself every day. I get to walk around this place, and if these walls could talk, right? But just a truly amazing person, an amazing story, and a very important part of the overall history and you know, Napa Valley winemaking.
Well, that's an incredible explanation. So for Thomas, who asked the question about the development of Rutherford, I think that's about as good as it gets in terms of both eloquence and clarity. And obviously, there's a lot of things that happen after that at Inglenook and a lot of other places. I mean, we could spend several hours talking about the development of all those properties on that bench, and then, you know, we'll talk a little bit later about the rise of mountain viticulture, which is a fairly recent thing in the history of Napa Valley. I think it's made only possible by the economics of the wine industry today, certainly not by the economics of the wine industry, you know, 50 or 60 years ago. But I want to ask Christy about your 01 Sycamore, because this is a fabulous vintage 01. I'm so glad you picked it, because in this era, usually everybody wants 02. And so you sort of picked the dark horse vintage, which I've always loved. You know, I had this incredible opportunity in 2011 and 2012, I had this incredible opportunity to taste the 10-year-old vintage with Bob Parker at the Napa Valley Vintners. And he loved this room freezing cold. Like, we would set the AC like as low as it would go. And he'd be wearing, you know, like his usual, like his black cutoff shirt. And I'd be like wearing like 3 sweaters. And I would pour the wine, you know, he was already not walking so great. So I would pour all the wines, and then we talk about them, and then we move to the next slide. But 01 was this vintage that just like nobody really, it just sort of seemed to come out of nowhere. And then when you tasted the wines with some bottle age, they were just spectacular. So tell us about your wine and why you picked it, Sycamore, what the story is, because the wine's showing great.
Absolutely, thank you. So for those of you who are watching who don't know, our library auction lot is a vertical of magnums from 97 to 01 of both the Bochet and the Sycamore Vineyard. So you could try them against each other and see which one you like best. The winemaker emeritus Ted and I love to do that, and so we'll pick favorites. But so I picked the 01 because you know, everybody talks about 97 and 98, and actually for Valentine's Day I had a 98 because I think they're tasting so beautiful right now, and from a winery that doesn't even exist anymore in Napa Valley. And I thought, you know, I'm from Texas. I grew up around horses. I love the dark horse, so I love that you made that analogy. It was a really small vintage, and you know, nobody kind of thought about it, but I was tasting through these wines the other day, and I thought, wow, this is really spectacular. Again, everybody talks about our Bochet vineyard. I think our Sycamore vineyard is the one you go to if you're looking for a wine that ages well. The berries are really small. So Trevor was talking about juice to skin ratio. This is something we like to geek out about as winemakers. That matters a lot when it comes to extraction quality of tannins, concentration, fruit character. And so our Sycamore vineyard has much, much smaller berries than our Bochet vineyard. So we get much more dark fruit character, lots of earth and savory components to it. It's an old vineyard now. It was only 5 or 7 years old at the time. So it was really coming back into its own. We've had numerous bouts with phylloxera. So in the mid 90s, just about everybody was replanting. So this vine was really starting to come into its own. And we thought, what a beautiful way to show this vineyard. We've been working with it already for a number of years, but the 01 I thought tasted beautiful, and I think it's drinking beautifully right now. And that's why I wanted to share it with you.
Well, I appreciate it. It's really great to taste these wines with some age. You know, you start to get that complexity that only comes with time, and it's showing great. So thanks for that. We'll talk about the auction lots again later, because I think it's an incredible collection of wines that the Vintners have put together for this event. So Chris, Inglenook, you know, I don't know if I've ever told you this, but the first time I went to Inglenook was 2011, in the middle of harvest. Poor Philippe had just arrived from Chateau Margaux. He looked ashen. It's like, what is this? I thought it was California. And I did a video interview with Francis Ford Coppola where I taped him. I recorded an interview with Francis Ford Coppola where I held the camera and he was on the screen. I bet that, you know, that doesn't happen too often. And, you know, I had met him before, but what's happened there over the last 10 years in particular has just been nothing short of remarkable. Historic property, yes. Wine quality in the past, somewhat up and down. All of a sudden, it gets really serious. The wine quality goes way up. There's more of a differentiation between the wine. This wine, your top wine, comes from the back blocks of the property. So those blocks that go right up against the mountains. And that is, that's the classic bench that here we're talking about Rutherford. We'll talk about AVAs in a second, but that is like Vine Hill Ranch and those places that are right in that sweet tenderloin where you get a fantastic combination of soils that aren't too heavy, aren't too light. It's that, like we were talking about before in one of these other seminars a few days ago, that it's kind of like the Burgundian concept, that the best vineyards are those like they're right in the middle where you get the mix of kind of everything. Then you come in, you've taken over the winemaking there. Tell us about Rubicon and like what your view is of what England should be in the future. Yeah,
a good intro there. I would like to point out that there have been only several winemakers, but there's really been three owners. Gustav Niebaum, left the winery to John Daniel, who took over in the 30s, and the 40s, 50s, and 60s is the Daniel era. And yes, we're in the present, of course, but we also have it's hard to escape that past and not because we're dragged down by it, but because we're inspired by it. So I don't know if you've had the opportunity, one of my, first real, aha moments was tasting, I think it was a 1958 Inglenook I had with my tasting group at Inglenook sometime in the early 80s. And then, of course, John Daniel, like Gustav Niebaum, his standards were so high for quality that it was sort of like quality above economics, and things just slipped away. And then it went through a period of corporate ownership. So the third owner and the present owner, of course, is Francis Coppola and his family. And it's really an epic story because there could be a film about it because, in 1975, Francis, he's flush from the Godfather movie making and ends up with like 1,100 acres in Rutherford, and not the front property, not the chateau, but the whole back property with the captain's mansion. And he's like, he's not planning on being a grape grower, right? But all of a sudden he is a grape grower by definition. And it was Robert Mondavi in 1977 or so, in the basement of that mansion, they pulled out a bottle from the 1800s. We don't know exactly what vintage, something in the 1890s, we think. And Mondavi was with Francis when he had his Rubicon moment, where he knew he was going to put everything on the table and take a risk and go into winemaking because Mondavi said, you have no choice, you have to make wine. And so Francis has spent, starting in 75, that's 46 years now. And I don't know about you, but if I had X million dollars and 46 years on my hands, which it's a little too late for me anyway, I don't know that I would persevere and have the vision, because it does, whether it's at Beaulieu or it's at Freemark, I mean, it takes vision to really pull something off that will stand the test of time over centuries. Because that's what we're talking about here. I think Rutherford will be here in centuries.
But he also had a lot of ups and downs, which is important to point out, because I remember him telling me the story, like, I made all this money in this one movie, then I lost it all in this other one, then I made it back. So I mean, it's perseverance, but also through a lot of personal ups and downs, which most of us who have more normal jobs would never have these massive boom and bust kind of cycles, of which he's been through several. It's pretty remarkable. But
he's settled into this harmonious state. The man's energy is pretty phenomenal. And but it's this vision thing, it's like when I worked for Christian Moex, where at Dominus, yes, he's talking to you, he's very present, but he also is looking out sort of into the middle distance, very forward thinking of the future. So to that end, I'm finally getting to your reference to 2011, a vintage which by many accounts was was a disaster. By the way, Asimov just published this weekend a wonderful piece, if you saw it, on a retrospective he did of the 2011 vintage, which included Rubicon. So check that out. But you know, Francis, bringing Philippe in from Chateau Margaux, really looking back at the first Rubicon was 1978. So looking back at these wines, and that's 78, we'll have to try that sometime when you're up, because that is a phenomenal wine. And Andrei Chelychev, by the way, was the consulting winemaker for those first few years, which were really got Francis off to a good start. And then, you know, we've instituted a 50-year replanting plan, a reconstruction of the vineyard, which, by the way, reboots every year. So there's always 50 years left. And then, although we do make progress, it just reboots every year. And then also, we're constructing an underground winery right now with 120 fermenters, one for every single growing area on our 235-acre property. Going back to Rubicon, the 2005 vintage, why we chose that today, I thought it well represented, you know, 16 years in. So we had a different winemaking style back then in the 90s and the early 2000s, which was tended more towards the vogue of higher extraction, riper fruit, more alcohol. But in spite of that, in this vintage, which was very cool in the spring and rainy, warm summer, but again, it was rainy in the fall, a vintage not highly touted by all wine writers. The winemaker at the time managed to get, and I think this wine it actually has a very profound, deep black cherry at 16 years, which is phenomenal, and a huge amount of depth. There was as my fellow winemakers on today know, it was a huge crop in 2005, and it was only those of us that really took thinning seriously that we managed to make wines that were ripe. So I think this expresses ripeness, and the legacy of Rutherford, the legacy of Inglenook and the benchland, you know, sort of, is coming right through and transcending whoever was the winemaker at the time, you know. So
I'm glad you mentioned that history, because obviously, you know, we could spend like 3 hours talking about the history of each of these estates, all of the nuances, all of the ups and downs. And that's one of the things that makes these wines and these estates so fascinating. There's so many layers. One of the things that Rutherford is, of course, known for is this mythical Rutherford dust. So, Trevor, what is that exactly? Is it something chemical in the soils that creates it? Is it a flavor? Is it a texture? Or what is Rutherford dust?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because I
didn't ask it. A couple of people, several people watching asked it, so I take no credit.
I'm glad the point came up, because that's something that, you know, I should have really mentioned when we were talking about Andrei Chelychev in particular, because he's the one that first brought that term to light. And he was famously quoted as saying, probably sometime during the 1960s, that in order to grow great Cabernet, it takes a lot of Rutherford dust in the Napa Valley. And I think he was, you know, at the time, really referring to the unique terroir, the soil profile, the microclimate, this just amazing wine growing region that we're so fortunate to have here in Rutherford. And pretty quickly after that, it started becoming, you know, commonly used as a sensory term and a descriptor for wines coming out of the Rutherford district, for Cabernet in particular, coming out of the Rutherford district. And it's a bit subjective, but to me, it's kind of that, you know, that forest floor, dark fruit profile that you get aromatically, kind of this dusty profile, if you will, in a very good way. And then on the palate, it's kind of a textural thing. So it's kind of a cocoa powder texture and flavor associated with that you get on the mid palate and the finish in particular, that's highly distinctive to the Rutherford growing region. So it's a pretty complex phrase. It means a few different things, but you know, when it was originally quoted, he was really referring to the unique terroir that we have.
Yeah, I agree. It is very much this kind of cocoa or chocolatey kind of tannin sensation, and it is very distinct. I mean, you wouldn't say that about St. Helena.
Yeah.
You wouldn't say that about Calistoga. You wouldn't say that about Oakville. It is really that area. It's pretty cool. Christy, there's a couple questions about replanting in the Napa Valley. Obviously, in Napa Valley, relative to other parts of the world, owners have a much lower tolerance for even the smallest imperfection in a vineyard. You know, you see things get replanted in Napa Valley that in other places would get left for years, maybe more, many more years to produce grapes. But there's also some issues with the quality of things that were planted some years ago before there was testing for all of the different maladies. So what is the current status of replanting in Napa Valley? What are the trends? What's happening? There's a question about it seems like a lot of vineyards are being replanted. So why would somebody have that perception?
Well, I think we're doing a lot of replanting along the two main roads that everybody sees. But to Chris's point, most of us have a very long-term replanting plan, and it's for the health of the vineyard. It's not because we're so ego-driven that, you know, we want absolutely the perfect thing. But to your point, you know, we do plant a lot of vineyard land in California. And so we do have a lot of nurseries, and we've had some problems with viruses. And so we're trying to constantly innovate to help with that. And 2020 and 2021 are the best years to say, you know, we're always having to innovate around Mother Nature and what they throw at us. So yes, we replant. I would say Trevor and Chris would probably echo this sentiment. We do it in a very responsible way, in a very sustainable way. We're always looking for what is nature going to give us over the next 30 to 50 years. A lot of the vineyards in the old world have been there a long time, but they replant in a different way. They interplant. They don't replant the entire vineyard. So to say a vineyard is 100 years old, not every vine there is 100 years old. Some of them are 5 years old, some are 20, some are 100. It's just the different economics. We work on a different economical scale in Napa, and we really like to be sustainable. We occasionally mechanize things where that really makes sense. And so replanting the entire vineyard rather than interplanting makes a whole lot more sense for us. And we're kind of always looking at new clones, new root stocks that could really help us work around whatever nature gives us. Everything from a 2011 to a 2015 to a 2020, our vineyards have to be able to deal with that. And those are three very, very different vintages. And so we're just looking to make our best decisions. And, you know, we all have to make money for our owners at the end of the day, or we hope to. Not every year we do. But we're really trying to be sustainable, and we're always looking out for the best quality wine. So in the customer's best interest, in the best interest of the environment, for sure. And what's best for what we're going to have to deal with for the next 30 years. So we're kind of always replanting 10-ish% of the vineyard. You know, it depends on the year. So yes, they've seen a lot of replants happening. Those are mostly on the valley floor right now. It's just because we've gone through these cycles. A lot of us replanted in the early 90s. We were using a rootstock that we thought was phylloxera resistant. Turns out it actually wasn't. Then a lot of us went over to 10114, which we thought was phylloxera resistant. Again, some of it is, some of it isn't. So it's just these, as we innovate, we're learning the limitations of what we innovate to and looking toward what's the next many decades ahead.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I mean, I think it does bear pointing out that on average, vineyards in Napa Valley are younger than they are in other parts of the world. There was that phylloxera issue in the early 90s. Then there's things like Pierce's disease, for which there was no testing when a lot of vineyards were planted. And that spreads. So you can't interplant. You know, you have to, if you make a decision, you have to take out a large chunk of vineyard. You can't just replace dead vines like you can, as you said, people do in Europe, commonly in other parts of the world, in other regions. So there's more testing now, and hopefully the things that are getting planted now, you're not going to find out 5 or 10 years if they have some sort of issue. But I do think Napa Valley is this place where, in general, there's such a standard of such excellence that a lot of things somebody just makes a decision. I'm going to have to tear this out in 5 years anyway, so I might as well do it now, kind of a calculus, you know? And so I think that's why you see a lot of that vineyard development. So, but I mean, I think it's, we see the difference in the wines, so it's pretty cool. So there's a lot of fantastic questions. One of them is, you know, a topic that's obviously happening, is really important in all of our lives, and that's climate change. So Chris, I'm curious, are you thinking about, I mean, Inglenook has a lot of varieties planted. Many people don't know that, but there are these blocks in the back that have all sorts of different grapes. Are you thinking about changing the varietal mix at the property in response to climate change, or are you addressing that more through let's say, pruning, farming, training methods, et cetera?
Well, it's something we're thinking about a lot. And for instance, we do everything we can to lower our carbon footprint. We have all electric vehicles on the back of the property, not tractors yet, but I'd say that's probably going to be coming if Francis has his way. You know, we don't burn our old vines. We grind them up and take them off property. You may not know that we have, we produce a white wine called Blancano. We also produce Sauvignon Blanc. In the past, some of these white varieties have been planted on that back bench because the feeling was that it was a little too shaded. It was a little too cool for Cabernet. Well, guess what? We think we're trying now, and I would say probably within 5 to 6 years, all of those blocks will be replaced by Cabernet. So that's a response to this shift. Also, something Philippe really introduced, we had been irrigating a lot in the decade or so before Philippe came. We irrigate very little now and generally not until August, because we are trying to keep our vines very small. And that was something that really struck me when I arrived at Inglenook, that there's sort of this natural, and I think grapevines left on their own, and they're not dry farmed. I think there's a big distinction between very judicial use of irrigation and dry farming. But we want to conserve water to them. It's part of this game. And if you can't, going forward, if we're going to have limited amounts of water, this year we have about 7 inches of rain. In a year we're expecting 36 or more, right? So we're already a little bit leery about what this year is going to bring. So conserving water, that's a response to the climate changing. But a vine left on its own and weaned from over irrigation is better able to handle a warmer climate. Looking at your trellising, we also shifted row direction. We're going completely 90 degrees from the traditional planting in Inglenook because we have a better chance, and we don't do VSP, vertical shoot positioning. We're trying to use the vine to shade itself and protect itself from sun damage. And so we're not really experimenting with other varieties yet. I would venture to say that we're still going to be growing Cabernet here on the Rutherford bench in 50 years. That's just my feeling.
Well, it certainly seems to have found a very good home there in terms of, when you taste these wines, the personality, the character, the ability to respond to those challenging vintages. I spent several weeks in Napa Valley in 2011 during the harvest, and all of the European winemakers were pretty chill. And all of the American young winemakers were freaking out because they had never seen botrytis in red grapes. But and then I remember one day going to Pritchard Hill, and as soon as you get above the fog, it's like, sunny and warm, and it's like, did I just like go into some other world here? What just happened? That's the beauty of terroir in Napa Valley. There's a lot of it to explore. I want to just touch base on. So thank you for that explanation, Chris. As I said, every time I listen to you, it's like being in school. I thought it'd be fun to just go over some of these lots that you guys have put together, because there's some amazing wines available from here. And I just want to make sure that we share what those are exactly for the benefit of our audience. So looking at the BV lot titled Quel Beaulieu, appropriately, you have 6 bottles of 2012 Clone 4 and 6 bottles of 2012 Clone 6. Then you have same thing in 13, which is the vintage that we tasted here. 6 bottles of 2013 Clone 4, 6 bottles of 2013 Clone 6. And then going a little bit further back, you have a 1.5 liter Magnum, one each of 07 Clone 4 and 2010 Clone 6. So those are both pretty important vintages that are older. So that's pretty fun to taste. Going to the Freemark Abbey lot, Christie's lot, that, as she said, it's verticals of the 2 wines, right? The Bochet and the Sycamore. You can taste them 97 through 2001 in Magnum, and that's 1 Magnum of each, so 10 Magnums, pretty cool. Doesn't happen every day. And then Inglenook is part of this incredible lot of Rutherford Dust Society lots. It's 22 Magnums. And there's one, and that includes a visit at each of these estates, you know, when that is again possible, which I am very optimistic it's going to be possible soon. But your wine in there is that 2005 red blend that you talked about earlier. So that's 22 lots, 22 magnums from Rutherford Dust Society members, and so those are all reference point wines. So pretty cool collection. So thanks for being so generous. It's, I think, going to be an incredible auction. So I'd like to just thank you all for being here today. It's really, really fun. It's really great to be able to have a conversation without some appointment before or after and some like enormous raft of wines. Just be able to talk about some of these details like this is just really great. So thank you very much for being here, Christy, Trevor, Chris. Really fun. Remember that the bidding is open for the library auction, so I'd encourage you to be generous if you can. Obviously, there's a lot of questions in a session like this, and we can't get into all of it. You know, things about fires and what's going to happen to the future of Napa Valley, but you know, supporting the region, I think, is really important. And so the auction is one way to do that. We've got 2 more sessions left, and again, these are available for replay if you want to watch it again. But tomorrow we'll be talking about the cooler corner of the Southern Valley. So that's Coombsville, Stagsley, Okanola, etc. And then, as I said, on Thursday, we're going to wrap up and look at some of the historic varieties, which, you know, we mentioned here some of them, but things like Petit Syrah and Zinfandel and Sauvignon Blanc and et cetera, et cetera. So thanks everyone for tuning in. Thank you guys for your time. It was really, really fun. And I'm going to pour myself a glass of this wine. And this happens to be year 18 Rubicon, Chris. But cheers to you all. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow for the next Napa Valley sessions. Thanks.
Thank you, Antonio. Take care.